Welcome back to the best book ever. Last week, we were commissioned to tell people the truth about God and Jesus, his son. This week, we're ending one series and starting a new one as we investigate what happened 50 days after Jesus' resurrection. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now, there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretians and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They've had too much wine." I've discovered that some people think this was the first Pentecost. It wasn't. The Jews had been celebrating Pentecost every year since they entered the Promised Land over 12,000 years before Jesus was born. Here's the command given via Moses to the priest regarding this feast. Count off 50 days up to the day after the seventh Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. On that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. If you read the chapter in full, you will find that the counting off of 50 days begins with the day of first fruits, which coincides with the day Jesus rose from the grave. Mr. Bradford revealed that lost in translation within this extract is the requirement to treat the Feast of Pentecost as a pilgrimage festival, a festival when every man was required to attend the temple to worship God. But what is Pentecost, or Shavuot in Hebrew? To the Jew, it was the second harvest festival of the year, celebrating the start of the wheat harvest. The first celebrated the start of the barley harvest, just after Passover, and the third, 6 months later, celebrated the completion of the harvest, with the Feast of Tabernacles. All three required a sacred assembly, where all the men gathered to worship God in the temple, thanking Him for the harvest. To the Christian, Pentecost has an added dimension, because this is the day the Holy Spirit came on the disciples. If Jesus was the first fruit of those who would rise freed from death in His name, then the disciples became the wave offering, celebrating the start of the second harvest. Notice how the Spirit came upon the disciples. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. I understand Dr. Baruch to have said that the coming of the Spirit should be better translated as the sound of a gentle yet powerful wind. I find this translation more satisfying than the one I grew up with, because whenever I read that the Holy Spirit came like a violent wind, I imagine it knocking things over, breaking vases, and causing confusion and destruction. This is not the God I know from the Bible, but it is the devil I've learnt about. For Jesus called the devil a thief when he said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Did you realize that this wind was the same wind that moved over the darkness at the beginning, waiting for the word to speak life into this world? The side effects of the coming of the Holy Spirit are worth your attention. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language?" The disciples began speaking in languages they had never learnt and possibly had never heard before. They were so busy praising God that they didn't realize what was happening outside until a large crowd had gathered, drawn like a magnet, all exclaiming, "How is it I can understand you?" Next week, we'll find out how Peter used Joel to answer their question. Have you ever wondered about the different countries listed? Did you realise there are 15 cities and countries named that represent almost all of the Roman world, everywhere that Jews could be found? This means the Holy Spirit came on more than just the 11 apostles. He came to all of the followers of Jesus who were in that place, obeying Jesus' command. He came on men and women, slaves and free, old and young, rich and poor. God made no distinction, and neither should we. Many teachers overemphasize the last line of our extract, while others ignore it altogether. Some, however, made fun of them and said they've had too much wine. This simply confirms that if the devil is working in the midst of such a great miracle to spread doubt, confusion, and lies, he will do just as Jesus said he would, and continue to bring these things to those who want to know the truth wherever the gospel is preached. Do not be surprised if you are opposed when you go to obey our calling to tell people about Jesus. As an aside, did you realize that the crowd was primarily made up of the most devout Jewish men who had traveled there for the Feast of Pentecost? It was a significant interruption to the harvest season, especially if you lived a long way away, as was the case for many of those listening. Next week, we will look at Peter's first sermon and how these devout, God-fearing Jews responded to the good news of Jesus crucified. I'll see you then. God bless you. Bye.